I have this, in fact, this little thing that I do every year, which is on the morning of my talk, I open the schedule of the festival to see, because I've forgotten, to see what preposterous thing I said I would be talking about. So this morning I did that. I opened up my little thing and I said, what did I say I was going to talk? And it says tokens, pioneers, pariahs, tokens, right? And that is, in fact, what I am going to talk about. And I don't know how that happened. How did I know? Did I plant this idea unconsciously in my brain? I mean, so I was completely thrown for a loop by this fact. So David Goliath is about asymmetrical conflicts and all of the surprising ways in which the weaker party can win and the larger, more powerful party is enfeebled. But this talk is about the opposite. I'm interested in the illicit strategies that the stronger party use to stay strong, to stay in power. And I use the word illicit because I'm not talking about legitimate means. I'm talking about ways in which they work the system that are ultimately wrong and unfair. So this talk there's three components. One is a very, very general idea. One is a hypothesis and one is a story. The general idea is, what I'm interested in is the notion of contradiction. How do human beings not seek to avoid contradiction in their own beliefs and lives, but rather the weird ways in which people embrace contradiction? Because I believe that this is something that I've thought about quite a lot recently. I feel like we have an expectation that one of the functions of human personality is to iron out inconsistencies. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think actually what we do is we're constantly trying to exploit inconsistencies in our life. That's the general idea. The hypothesis is very simple, and this talk is going to be about the following. I would like to hypothesize that if Hillary Clinton wins the next presidential election, she will be the last female president we will have for a very, very long time. That's the hypothesis. And the story is about an artist. By the way, all these strands will come together. just be calm. Let's take a step backward for a moment and think about the relationship between insiders and outsiders. How is it that outsiders come to be accepted by the majority? So in the beginning, the outsider is a pariah. They're not allowed in at all, right? So you have in baseball, before the color line is broken, if you're a black baseball player, you can't play in the majors. There are no exceptions to this. They flat out won't hire anyone who has the wrong skin color, right? So you're the pariah. And then what happens in baseball? Well, in 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers accept Jackie Robinson as their first baseman. And after Jackie Robinson, the door opens for Jackie Robinson, the door opens for everybody else, right? There's a flood of black ball players who sign with Major League franchises. So Jackie Robinson is a pioneer. And what you see in baseball is the transition from pariah to pioneer, right? No one gets let in, then one guy gets let in, and then the door opens for everybody else. I think we understand that narrative very well. That is the traditional narrative of progress in our society. If you can look at any number of cases where pariahs turn into pioneers. That's the story of apartheid in South Africa, right? Pariah and pioneers. That's the story of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, not just in baseball, but in numerous other areas. Blacks were on the outside, then they were let into the mainstream. It's the story of the suffragette movement. Women couldn't vote, and then one by one, in one country after the world, they were given the right to vote. They were accepted. They went from pariahs to pioneers. Right? But those are clearly not the only categories, right? Because there are all kinds of cases where sometimes the door opens to an outsider, but it doesn't stay open. It closes. So the first female commercial airline pilot was Helen Ritchie, who flew for Central Airlines in 1934. And at the time, people looked at Helen Ritchie and said, oh, she's a pioneer. All kinds of women are now going to be pilots. Wrong. Do you know what percentage of commercial airline pilots today are women? 7%. the door was open for Helen Richie and then it was closed, right? Or the first female neurosurgeon was Sofia Ionescu in Bucharest in 1943. And people looked at Dr. Ionescu and they said, oh, neurosurgery is soon going to become open for women. They assumed she was going to be a pioneer. Was she a pioneer? No. The door closed. Do you know what percentage of neurosurgeons today are female? 7%, right? Never happened, this transformation that we all. So there are pariahs. Sometimes the pariah turns into a pioneer, but sometimes the pariah becomes a token. A token is someone who gets let in by the majority, and then the majority turns around and closes the door after them. Now, what distinguishes a pioneer from a token? And why does the door stay open for some but close behind others? It doesn't seem to make any sense. If I'm in the majority and I accept one member of a class of people, surely that would mean that I would have no objection to any member of that class. If I'm willing to accept one black ball player, it seems logical. I would accept all black ball players, right? If Helen Richie gets to fly for Central Airlines in 1934 and everything is fine, then why aren't all airlines willing to accept female pilots? But I think what's puzzling about, what's fascinating about the phenomenon of the token is that even though it seems irrational, it happens all the time. In fact, I think there are more cases of tokens than there are of pioneers. In fact, I think it tells us that that discrimination is a more complex phenomenon than we normally assume. Discrimination is not about just simply me turning my back on an entire class of people. What discrimination is a subtle and invidious combination of acceptance and rejection. Very often the discriminator may do both things in order to sustain their pattern of exclusion. Well, I think what's going on here is a version of what the psychologist Binet Monin has called moral license. And he's done all of this really interesting work where he looks at, proposes that as human beings, when we make sense of our behavior, we do a kind of complex accounting, that we use pro-social or moral choices as ways of justifying antisocial, immoral choices, right? It's like carbon offsets. Because we do a good thing over here, we feel justified for doing a bad thing over here. Now that's an interesting notion because for the longest time in psychology, we have thought that people very rigorously police their behavior in order to enforce some kind of consistency. That when we said that you are moral, what we meant is that you are someone who tends to behave in a moral way in all aspects of your life. What Monin is saying is no, that's not how we behave. As human beings, what we do is we do the good thing over here, and then we use that to justify doing the bad thing over here. Right? In other words, the Germans did not hate Jews in spite of the fact that they loved Bertolt Auerbach. They hated Jews because of the fact they loved Bertolt Auerbach. Opening the door to Bertolt Auerbach is what allowed them to justify closing the door to everybody else. And people then looked at that first woman and said, oh, the door must finally be opening for women. But did it really open? Do you know what percentage of art hanging on the walls of American museums was painted by women? 5%. Just enough for the people running museums to say, we're not biased against women. We hung so-and-so on the line in gallery 2. So do you see why I am so pessimistic about the possibility that if Hillary Clinton won, we would get another female prime minister, president anytime soon? In fact, if you look at the history of women as head of states around the world, what is striking is how many times countries have had one female head of state and only one female head of state. That having elected one person to be their leader, they wash their hands and say, okay, we're done. Here's the list. Right? Israel, India, Britain, Germany, Costa Rica, Finland, Nicaragua, Latvia, Panama, Bolivia, Sri Lanka, Ecuador, Haiti, Pakistan, Poland, Turkey, New Zealand, France, and Canada. And while we're on the subject, here are the list of American cities that have had one and only one black mayor. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. I'm not convinced we're going to have another black president anytime soon. Sometimes when the door is opened, it's open for everybody else. Sometimes when the door is opened, it gets shut.